On March 13, 1881, a Russian autocrat believed he'd just survived an assassination attempt. He was wrong about what was about to happen. I've studied enough autopsy reports to know the difference between luck and timing. Alexander II, Tsar of all Russia, liberator of the serfs, reformer, thought he'd dodged death that morning. He hadn't. He'd only delayed it by hours. What makes this story worth your attention isn't the bomb itself. It's what the people holding the fuses believed they were fighting for, and how catastrophically wrong they turned out to be. March 1881, St Petersburg, the city was a powder keg and everyone in the Winter Palace knew it. Alexander II had spent the previous 2 decades loosening the chains of serfdom, introducing legal reforms, even flirting with constitutional government. But he'd also tightened security obsessively. Bombs had been thrown at him before. Assassins had tried, and failed. By 1881, he was 62 years old, tired, and convinced he could survive anything. The people's will, Narodnaya Volya, were the ones planning to prove him wrong. They weren't anarchists in the modern sense. They were revolutionaries with a specific target, the Tsar himself. They believed that killing Alexander II would trigger a chain reaction, that the death of the autocrat would spark mass uprisings, that the people would rise, that the system would collapse. They'd been planning this for years, and on this particular Sunday morning they were ready. Here's what the Tsar didn't know yet. 5 separate assassination teams were positioned across St. Petersburg that Sunday. Some carried dynamite, others carried bombs disguised as packages. One team had rented an apartment directly above a street the imperial carriage was scheduled to cross. They drilled holes in the floor. They were waiting. And Alexander II, who'd survived countless threats, was about to walk straight into a trap he couldn't see coming. Morning came. The Tsar attended a military parade, as scheduled. He'd been warned his security detail had picked up intelligence about threats, but he refused to alter his routine. That was his mistake. Around 2 p.m., his carriage began moving through the streets toward the palace. The drivers didn't know they were moving toward history. Neither did the guards. Neither did the crowds watching from the sidewalks. The first bomb came at 2:15 p.m. A revolutionary named Rysakov threw it directly under the carriage. The explosion was massive. It killed 2 guards and a bystander. The blast lifted the carriage itself off the street. But Alexander II survived. His armor-plated coach held. He climbed out, shaken but alive, and made what might have been the worst decision of his life. He walked toward the scene of the explosion. I've read the contemporary accounts myself. The Tsar wanted to see what had happened. He wanted to see the damage. He wanted to demonstrate that he wasn't afraid. What he didn't know, what his security detail didn't know, was that the people's will had anticipated exactly this. They positioned a second operative just 50 feet away, waiting for precisely this moment. The Tsar had just stepped into the kill zone. The second operative's name was Ignacy. He was 26 years old. He held a small package in his hands. As the Tsar stood examining the wreckage, Grynvetsky stepped forward and threw it directly at Alexander's feet. The explosion came at 2:35 p.m. This time there was no escape. The blast tore through the Tsar's legs. Shrapnel embedded itself in his body. Guards fell. Civilians screamed. Alexander II was dying. He knew it immediately. His legs were mangled. Internal bleeding had already begun. Guards rushed him back to the Winter Palace, but there was nothing to be done. He was carried to his private chambers. Grynvetsky, mortally wounded by his own bomb, was arrested at the scene. He would die in prison hours later, never knowing what happened next. 3:30 p.m. Alexander II was still conscious. His wife was with him. His doctors were there. And in those final hours, while revolutionaries celebrated in the streets believing they'd triggered the great uprising they'd dreamed of, the Tsar made one final decision. He signed a decree, a real one, authorizing the creation of consultative assemblies. It was the closest Russia would come to constitutional government for decades. He died at 3:35 p.m. Here's where the story gets dark. The people's will had gambled everything on one assumption, that killing the Tsar would spark revolution. They were wrong. The new Tsar, Alexander III, was nothing like his father. He was reactionary, conservative, vengeful. Within weeks, he'd repealed his father's reforms. Within months, he'd tightened the screws so hard that Russia wouldn't see another chance at constitutional reform until 1905, and even then, it would take another revolution. The conspirators were hunted down. Most were arrested within days. 5 of them, including the woman who'd coordinated the entire operation, Sofia Perovskaya, were hanged in April 1881. Their executions were public. Thousands watched, and instead of sparking uprising, the hangings terrified the population into submission. The people's will had achieved the exact opposite of what they'd intended. The irony is almost too bitter to state plainly. Alexander II was the most liberal Tsar Russia had produced in generations. He'd freed the serfs. He'd reformed the military, the judiciary, the education system. He'd been moving, slowly, cautiously, but genuinely moving, towards something that resembled constitutional governance. And the people who murdered him believed they were striking a blow for freedom. Instead, they'd guaranteed decades of oppression. What fascinates me after reading through all the interrogation records, all the confessions, all the manifestos, is that none of them saw it coming. Not one revolutionary predicted that killing the reformer would lead to reaction. They were so certain of their theory, so convinced of historical inevitability, that they couldn't imagine a different outcome. They were wrong, and Russia paid the price for that certainty. The assassination of Alexander II didn't end Russian autocracy. It entrenched it. It didn't spark the revolution the peoples will believed in. It delayed it by a quarter century, and when revolution finally came in 1905 and 1917, it came not because of bombs thrown by idealists, but because of systemic collapse, war, and hunger. History doesn't move the way revolutionaries plan. It moves in ways they can't predict, and often can't control. March 13, 1881. That date marks the moment when Russia's window for gradual reform slammed shut. It marks the moment when certainty killed possibility. And it reminds us that the most dangerous people in history aren't always the ones who wield the most power. Sometimes they're the ones who are absolutely certain they know what comes next. Subscribe, there's a new assassination, a new conspiracy, and a new moment where history pivoted in a direction nobody saw coming.